Discussion in the convention centered principally on something we've come to call the Virginia Plan. It had been drafted by James Madison. It was introduced by Governor Randolph, and it provided for a strong central government in sharp contrast with the Articles of Confederation. Later on, there was a second plan called the New Jersey Plan, introduced by the governor of New Jersey, Patterson. What it maintained was state equality. It proposed a unicameral legislature, a single chamber, in which each state should have one vote. There was no mention of a chief executive, and this plan was a reaction against the Virginia Plan, and that's about it. It did not get serious consideration, but it did command the attention of a good many people from the small states. The political life of the convention centered around a whole series of conflicts. A big and obvious one is big states against little states, and that pops up in all sorts of forms and various times. Then there was the North against the South. Then there was the slave states against the non-slave states, which is not quite the same thing. The issues of populism versus the establishment, whether the new government should assume the debts that the states had incurred, the budding manufacturing interest as against the agricultural interest, landless states and landed states, a conflict between those who had land claims out beyond the mountains and those who didn't, where the seat of the new government should be located. How centralized should this government be? How much power should be put in the hands of the new government, and how much power should remain with the states? The big states generally would have gone much farther than the smaller states. The smaller states were afraid that they'd be overwhelmed. Madison, in the Federalist Papers, argued, "The new Constitution is in strictness neither a national nor federal constitution, but a composition of both." Well, okay, that's fair enough, and I think they thought that's about what they had done. So that was a general issue. A more particular, more precise issue was, to what extent should the national government be given control over commerce? And here again, you get North versus South. The North would have given the central government a lot more power than the South would have done. The South didn't want the national government to control exports and imports because they depended so strictly on their own capacity to export cotton and tobacco. Well, the solution is a very neat political solution. They split it 50-50. Export taxes were prohibited. Import taxes were permitted, but they had to be uniform among the states, which is a very neat sort of compromise and illustrates neatly precisely the kind of politicking that had to go on. Then there was the question of slavery, on which there were really two issues. One was the institution of slavery itself. The other deals with the capacity to import slaves. There was a strong anti-slave sentiment, but not a strong sentiment for abolition, because nobody knew how to do it or what the consequences would be. The document says nothing about slavery. It's just left out. The word never appears. It's a great silence, and it's one of the most important compromises. We can't figure out what to do, so we didn't do anything, just left it out. On the importation of slaves, nothing could be done for 20 years. And during that 20 years, there would be a tax of not more than $10 per capita on any slaves imported. And here's a nice little quotation from James Madison. 20 years will produce all the mischief that can be apprehended from the liberty to import slaves. Well, James Madison was a very wise man, but he missed on that one. Then there was the further question of whether to count the slaves in the enumeration of the population for purposes of representation. The South argued that they should be counted. Obviously, that would increase their representation in the Congress. But they didn't want to count the slaves when it came to taxation. And the North, exactly the opposite. So they found a resolution. They decided to count 3/5 of the slaves for both purposes. 3/5, for heaven's sake. That doesn't make any rational sense at all. It may be a reasonable solution to the political problem, but it's a result both marvelous and absurd, and may help explain why 4 of the first 5 presidents of the United States came from Virginia. Well, the greatest compromise of all was on the nature of representation in the national legislature. The big states argued that population should be the basis of representation. The small states argued that every state should be equally represented, and the convention was deadlocked on it for weeks. The solution came in something called the Connecticut Compromise. We'll have 2 houses, one based on one principle and the other based on the other principle. The lower house to be represented by population, the upper house by state equality. It permitted a central government to be created, and it seemed to preserve the equality of the states in the Senate. The compromise, called the Connecticut Compromise, was actually proposed by Ben Franklin, a representative of Pennsylvania and then of Congress, as representative to England and then to France. And it was Ben Franklin more than anybody else who brought the French in to support the colonists in the Revolution itself. And in France and in England, he was liked and admired both by the politicians and by adoring women. He was respected as a scientist, perhaps the best-known scientist in the Western world. He explained a lot of natural phenomena, including the Gulf Stream. He invented the Franklin stove. He invented daylight savings, bifocals, the lightning rod, the first fire department, the first lending library, the University of Pennsylvania, the American Philosophical Society. America is quite different and quite richer for having had Ben Franklin. And if you are in a situation where you get questioned about early America and you don't know what the answer is, just say Ben Franklin, and you're more likely to be right than wrong. Well, the convention did its work and sent it to Congress, and then began the fight in the states to decide whether to approve what the convention had done and the Congress represented. And that's what we'll talk about next time.